All right. Hello, guys. This is Christian Idealism, and today we're going to be doing a response video. Now, you're probably wondering why, Kyle, do you not have your camera with you? Well, the very simple reason is that I don't have my camera because I left it at my old house. So today's stream, I'm not going to be showing my face, but we will be doing a response video, and that response video is going to be. I actually just found this like a few days ago, so keep in mind that I didn't even know about this response video until recently. So let me see here. Yep, there it is. So now, as you could probably all see, this is an hour and a half long, over hour and a half long video response to what I had to say on Zach's channel. And so I don't know if I'm going to necessarily go over everything. But I will try to go over as much as I can, and I will try to give a response to each point that he tried to do. So I don't know how long this stream is going to be. It's probably going to be, I would say, a few hours. So just because I'm going to try to respond to as much as I can, but we'll see how it goes. Anyways, with that in mind, let me make sure my thing is working. Because last time I had this problem, last time I tried to do a stream, it actually crashed. So hopefully it doesn't happen again. But yeah, whatever. Anyways, let's get started then with the video.
All right, and we are and obviously, like the oldest known version goes back to Epicurus, but there's a lot more modern versions. Like obviously, there's Paul Draper's formulation of the problem of evil, which argues from super specific facts about pain and pleasure that they're more expected on theism. That they're more expected on naturalism, or what's known as a hypothesis of indifference, than Sorry. I need to think this. Sorry. So basically, what it argues is that there's
I'm gonna try to get to where he starts to make his point. Hold on.
Hey everyone, welcome back to Adherent Apologist. Super pumped for joining us today. I have Kyle Allender, also known as Christian Idealism, where we're talking about the problem of evil and how Christians can defeat it. So yeah, Kyle, thanks for joining me. How you doing?
Pretty good. Glad to be here.
I think we have a pretty ambitious target here in this video of defeating the problem of evil. So we're just gonna dive right into it. So do you have any general considerations you want to talk about when we're looking at the problem of evil?
Yeah. So I guess the first thing is to sort of tell a short story.
I'm actually
about
going to speed this up
I
because I just want to get through this a little bit faster. It's a 47-minute long video. So
so how is one part of mine, which was helpful, partner about issues, and me and him sort of worked together. We had to sort of read a lot of people's literature on this. I think one of the reasons, one say more, one to be honest together, right? So the problem was like, if you ask me where atheist or not, why don't believe God exists, or why do you think, the God's no good or something? It's gonna be probably like the number one problem for theism, right? It's been around for thousands of years, so this objection is not necessarily new. It is new, however, it's sort of the new formulation of the argument, right? And so, as I was looking, as you remember, from the evil, but it's not very good when it comes to natural evil or any other like evolutionary evil. Looking as me and Tim were researching this, we had to be honest with you guys, because at first my sort of approach prior to this was the approach of Clay Jones, and Clay Jones' Theodicy is, I think, pretty good for those parts.
So I'm actually not familiar with Clay Jones' approach to the problem of evil. I actually have not read him at all on this, and like based on what I've seen from him on live streams and such, I don't know, the man's just less than impressive to me, but maybe he has some good work on the problem of evil. I'm not exactly familiar. But yeah, I'm just not familiar with his Theodicy. So maybe he talks about it here a bit. Okay.
Oh, so that's what he's. Sorry, this is like one of my first times watching this, so I apologize if I have to.
Exactly remember.
Evil, but it's not very good when it comes to natural evil or any other like evolutionary evils.
I have a collection of works on like basically arguments against theism, and I've read the impossibility of God, but I have not read the improbability of God. There's actually a lot of good stuff in the impossibility of God that I checked out. Like, for example, you have Richard R. Lacroix, I think is how you pronounce his name. I think he's French, so Richard R. Lacroix. He has his own version of a problem of evil. It's like a logical problem of evil, which argues that since God is the greatest possible good, any evil that obtains in creation that entails greater goods are going to entail, by definition, lesser goods than the greatest possible good. So since the state of God existing alone is the greatest possible good and entails no evil, right? Because God entails no evil, like theists even believe this, like they believe in like prior purity. What God would have to do in order to create the world is you have to transition the world into a state of perfection to a state with perfection plus some evil, which just seems incompatible with perfection. So all
right. So I think the problem with at least that, I haven't read the argument, so I can't really comment too much on that specific argument. But it already sounds like you're gonna run into problems of incrementability, right? So the moment that you start talking about the best kind of work, because I've addressed this in my video already, but basically there is a distinction between the greatest possible being versus the greatest possible world, or at least kind of world. And I don't even think there is a best. I don't even think there is a best like when we're talking about a best world, I don't think I think when we talk about best world, I think we should talk about best kind of world and not necessarily best, I think the type token distinction is important here. But it sounds to me, at least given what he said on the argument, you're going to run into problems of incrementability as soon as you try to make that sort of case, at least that sort of logical argument, based on what it reads. So again, the reason why I mention this is just because there's a reason why I hold to the position I do. There's a reason why I think that the problem of evil doesn't work, right? And this is, of course, there's more I could say on this, which I will, but at least logical versions of the problem of evil just don't even get off the ground because they assume that value is can be sort of measured in this objective sense, and I don't think that is the case given the problem of incrementability. And so we have to be more careful, at least when we're gonna make these sort of strong claims that evil is incompatible with theism. I think that's I just don't think that could be defended at all, given that. But anyways, let's continue.
That's obviously, I think that's a much more stronger approach to the problem of evil than J.L. Mackie and his logical problem of evil, which I basically that's the version of the problem of evil that's the earliest one introduced into contemporary analytic philosophy of religion, and it doesn't really work out so well because basically there's the difficulty of trying to get the theist to commit to a set of claims that are commitments of theism, which jointly entail contradiction, and Mackie doesn't succeed in doing that, as Plantinga showed. I don't think Plantinga's free will defense is that good, but I think that he at least successfully shows that Mackie fails to derive a contradiction from.
Well, that's good to know. So at least he agrees with that Mackie's argument. At least that part of Mackie's argument doesn't work. So
theism. But I think that Richard R. Lacroix's attempt to derive a contradiction from premises that are plausibly commitments of theism, I think that that his attempt is way better. In his I think his paper is called Unjustified Evil and God's Choice. So I'm sorry, I've been talking about that.
Probably argument. And of course you have J.L. Mackie, which I read this probably twice now, and he presents his logical version of evil. So I had to, when I first started off, my sort of view was that evil is evidence against God. That evil at least has some weight, or at least that my general sort of view that I took was, okay, evil is evidence against theism, right? And that I just thought that the evidence for theism would outweigh it, right? So I took this sort of outweigh approach, okay, even if evil is evidence against theism, it's not strong enough to outweigh sort of the probability, right? That started to change when I started reading there was this one paper by Robert Bass called Principle of Plenitude.
So yeah, basically what he's talking about is that evil, he's basically his first approach was that he admits evil is enough to provide evidence against theism, but it's not enough to show that theism is positively irrational, given all the evidence taken into consideration, basically, right? And I think that's probably one of the best approaches to the problem of evil. Even in Rowe's original paper on the problem of evil,
I'm going to skip this because I'm trying to see where he starts to make objections.
I think that there's an interesting strategy you can do there to, when combining his approach with Michael Tooley's approach.
Basically, how he put his argument was that even if you get even 99% probability, evil would still outweigh theism. So basically, evil, at least evil, sort of the amount of evils would be enough to sort of tip against theism, right? Now, of course, again, even before I came to conclusion now, I didn't say his arguments. I didn't really agree with the way that he did probabilities, but I can sort of understand. Okay, an atheist, I can see why an atheist would sort of conclude even if you have all this evidence for theism.
I think I've actually read that paper on the problem of inscrutable evils, and I think that there's an interesting strategy you can do there to, when combining his approach with Michael Tooley's approach, that uses something similar to the principle of indifference. So basically, we'd argue, even if we assume something like skeptical theism, where we can't be justified.
Well, I mean, I'm not a skeptical theist, but I mean, I'll let him speak for this.
In believing that some instance.
All right, I'm gonna see because he doesn't really seem to be responding to what I have to say. So I'm just gonna go to the parts where he actually does respond to what I have to say because I don't want to spend too much time. At least I don't want to spend too much unnecessary time on these points. So let me get to where he starts making his real arguments.
At all, right? And there's a few, I guess, 4 reasons why we get into those, but there are reasons why I think that, and hopefully today I can sort of present those reasons. So yeah, I guess that's the general story. Basically, we started off with a false theodicy, then we worked through literature, and finally we came to a point where basically it's not a problem anymore. And my conclusion now is, of course, that I don't think the problem works at all, not even in the eventual sense. So the eventual probability is just 0 at that point. I know that, again, that's an extreme position, but I had to be honest with what I was looking at, and so that's what I can do.
Yes, I think that when we get through your points, Kyle, it doesn't kind of very ambitious claims that the problem doesn't work, it's a bad argument. But to do that, you really want to get into 4 big reasons that we'll into a minute. So it's really helpful. Listening to this to kind of understand where we're coming from, because obviously I know if all my reasoning the case, not friends to kind of understand where we're coming from, because obviously I know if all my reasoning the case, not friends to what the heck we're talking about.
Yeah.
But we got into it. I just say before we get into these 4 major problems.
I guess there are 2 general considerations I want to point out here. These are what I came to when I was doing my research. So the first, I guess, maybe one general consideration, which is that we have to understand what theism actually is as a hypothesis, right? So we have to understand that theism, because it's a metaphysical hypothesis, then we should only be concerned with fundamental facts about the world, right? So one of those fundamental facts is going to be why does God allow bad states of affairs to occur, right? It's not about okay, well, why does God allow hurricanes, why does God allow pain, pleasure, evolution, why does God those are sort of macro level phenomena. A more deep question in my mind, which is why do bad states of affairs occur, right? Because those are all bad states of affairs, right? And so given the type of hypothesis that theism is, then the only concern.
So there's actually already some difficulty I have with how he's framing this. Why would God allow bad state of affairs? I don't think that that's necessarily how I would frame the issue, right? Because bad is sort of like an axiological term, whereas if we want to actually like make predictions about what God would do, like we want to use deontological terms, right? Because
no. So that's false. So when we talk about what God would do, we need to use axiological terms. He mentions deontological terms, but that is a subset of axiology. So deontology, virtue ethics, pretty much all of normative ethics is a subset of axiology, right? Because that's the moral domain, right? In fact, I would say that the axiological, if we're going to, talk about the axiological domain for a second, I actually do think that encompasses the moral domain, the aesthetic domain, and of course the alethic domain. So there's actually 3 different domains that the axiological landscape covers, right? Now, deontology is a subset of axiology, but like that's pretty much common knowledge, right? So I think he's making a category error here. I think this is the first problem with his responses. He actually doesn't understand when I'm talking about axiology that literally covers everything, right? So when we're talking about good or bad states of affairs, like you can't go beyond that. You can't appeal to deontology because deontology is a subset of that, right? So I don't think he actually understands like what I mean when I talk about axiology versus, or axiology as a sort of the umbrella term to encompass the moral domain, right? So this is the first problem, which is he just gets category errors wrong in understanding like what I actually said, what my point was trying to be. So that's the first problem I just want to point out. But anyways, I'll continue on.
Because if something is wrong to do all things considered, then God wouldn't do that. Just in virtue of his moral perfection, God can't do anything wrong. All of God's actions have this property of rightness, right? So God can't do anything wrong.
Yes, God can't do anything wrong, which means God can only do good actions. Okay, yeah, that's. I think that's pretty standard, like understanding, right? And I think my characterization of the problem of evil is just asking the question of why does God allow bad states of affairs to occur? I think that does encompass all of evil. That encompasses, again, the moral domain, the aesthetic domain, and the alethic domain. So yeah, it does actually, I think, and by my lights, it does sort of get down to the very core of the question, right? And I think if the theist can't answer that, if the theist can answer the question of why God allows bad states of affairs to occur, and if they have a theodicy for that, then that's it. The problem of evil is finished. So any talk about deontology or virtue ethics or consequentialism or literally anything else is irrelevant because we've already answered the fundamental question, right? So that's all I have to say on that. But yeah, let's continue.
So if we use deontological terms and say that this state of
deontology is a subset of axiology, so no.
Affairs is all things considered wrong to permit, rather than just saying, oh, it's bad, then I think we avoid a lot of the issues of I mean, God would allow bad states of affairs to occur. I mean, like we would allow that. We would basically like sidestep that completely because no, the state of affairs is wrong to permit, right? It would be
it's bad. It's bad. yeah, that's the point. It's because deontology is a subset. So, anyways, I'm not going to say much on this particular objection because I don't think it works. But anyways,
moral if someone were to permit it, and like when we frame it like that, then there's no out for the theist there, like moral, right? And all of God's actions and what the morally best action is, or at least what's morally right, are going to be in perfect harmony, right? There's nothing that God does that's going to be morally wrong.
The question that the theist needs to answer, right, with evil is why does God allow bad states of affairs to occur, and why are there like bad properties, right? So why does God allow the bad properties to take hold? So I think that question sort of covers everything, right? So it covers the biological world, pain and pleasure. It covers brain thought. It covers any sort of evil you can possibly sort of imagine is going to sort of include that kind of question, right? So I think if the theist can answer that question, why does God allow bad states of affairs to occur, then the problem will just get nullified, right? It's not a problem anymore. It doesn't matter like what version of the problem we come up with, right? So that was sort of earlier in my journey before I came to my conclusion. That was
no, that's not true. If the theist can answer, sorry, I don't think I quite got what you said, but let me actually repeat that.
The problem will just get nullified, right? It's not a problem. Pain and pleasure. It covers brain thought. It covers like any sort of evil you can possibly sort of imagine is going to sort of include that kind of question, right? So I think if the theist can answer that question, why does God allow bad states of affairs to occur, then the problem will just get nullified, right? It's not a problem anymore.
No, not true at all. So yeah, like you could like the idea is yes, the theist can have an explanation for why God would allow bad states of affairs, or there can be like some story you can tell that makes it the case that theism is consistent with the hypothesis. That's fine, but I mean at least that's fine if you want to take an evidential approach. But the idea is theism a better explanation for the evil we see in the world? Is it more predictive of the evil we see in the world than naturalism or the hypothesis of indifference?
All right, so I think this is a fair objection, so to speak. And I think what's important to understand here is that when we're talking about making theism as a better explanation of the data of evil, right? I think that we need to understand like what's called value mapping, right? So what does this mean? Well, it means that is there a theodical connection between God and a bad state of affairs, right? So is there a sort of theodicy you can provide that accounts for that? And I think if you can provide a theodicy, if there's a theodical, what I say, theodical connection there um, to that, then yeah, I think theism does expect the data of evil, right? At least in the sense that, you know, as long as, of course, there are going to be constraints there, right? Obviously, we don't want to say that like God can just allow any type of evil, right? I wouldn't go that far, but I think if we do have a would I say a theodical connection between God and a state of affairs, then yeah, God, that's the explanation for why God allows it. Now, what about the indifference hypothesis? How does that fare with the indifference hypothesis? Well, the problem is the indifference hypothesis doesn't actually say anything about value. So the best that indifference can do, right, is that it can just say that, well, it's just more epistemically friendly on the indifference hypothesis that you would expect evil, right? And I think this is the way that Paul Draper does it, right? And I think, honestly, if you're going to make an argument from evil, that's where you want to go. But the problem is that as soon as the theist has makes a theodical connection there, then it's actually gonna favor theism, right? And of course, this is where Trent Dowdery's argument from, I think it was the saint making Theodicy. He makes his argument from animal suffering that basically, like, in order to have like certain virtues, you're gonna need like this fine tuning of virtues, right? And I mentioned this in the later in the video, but basically, like, given this fine tuning of virtues, that would actually be evidence for theism, whereas you can't use that same evidence to support naturalism, right? So that's what I would appeal to in terms of arguing of why theism actually does make positive predictions about evil, right? Or at least make successful predictions about evil. If you want to see more on that specific argument, I did it. You know, if you watch my long video on the problem of evil, which is the explanatory flexibility of theism, I sort of laid this out near the end. And of course, my next video on this channel, my next long video on this channel, is going to be going over that as well, more in detail, in terms of like the cumulative case for theism that I'm working on. But that's sort of what I would appeal to. So I do think that evil in that sort of, when you frame it that sort of way, and you know, this fine-tuned virtues way, I think evil is evidence for theism, but only in that sort of context, right? And that's all you really need. Whereas again, in a difference hypothesis, you're not going to make that same sort of positive predictions. The best you can do is say that, well, it's just more epistemically likely on naturalism, right? But again, I would dispute that. So anyways, I'm gonna continue on the video and see what else he has to say on this.
And I know, and that's going to be like what the atheists are going to say. They're going to say that theism doesn't better predict what we see in the world. Like, sure, like anyone could invent some story that makes their position basically explain facts in the world, even in like an ad hoc way or what have you, right? But the idea is, if like,
so this idea of, okay, so I get this a lot from atheists, but basically the idea is like, well, if we present a theodicy, isn't that just an auxiliary hypothesis? No, because what we're doing is we're updating the priors. So what we're doing is we are taking evil and suffering as the contextual evidence, right? And then from that, then we can think, and we can do what's called theoretical learning, or learning from hypotheticals. Is like, you know, let's just say, for example, that you make one round of predictions. Like the first round of predictions, like, okay, theism entails only good state of affairs. We only see bad states of affairs. Therefore, theism is false. Okay, that's the first round of predictions. Now, what the theists can do is they can step back and say, I wasn't expecting that. How about I change my theoretical content a little bit without adding stuff in, and then see if I get a different result, right? And I think once we do that, this is called the learning from experience or updating the priors. Then we can sort of make what's called a theodicy, right? From that, right? Um, and I'm not going to do the formal math on this here. I'm going to do that later in my later videos. But there's a way you can do this without entailing that theism is ad hoc, right? So this whole idea that like a theodicy is just an auxiliary hypothesis is just completely wrong. Now, granted, I do think that there are certain theodicies that are ad hoc, right? For one example is the fall theodicy or certain free will theodicies. I'm like, okay, those probably don't work, or at least if they do work, they only work like in a limited sort of way, or they only address like certain amounts of evil and not all of them, right? But I think the theodicy that I'm working with right now, I don't think has that problem. So obviously I'm gonna hold different views on that. But anyways, I've been rambling too long for now, so I'm gonna continue on with the video.
Their position, whether their position is going to have like theoretical virtues, right? Whether it's going to be simpler, whether it explains the facts in like a non-ad hoc way, right? You see the facts and a virtue of the theory, right? It's testable, it's informative, it doesn't undermine divine psychology such that, all states of affairs are going to be consistent with it, right? And the idea is you can't just kill the problem of evil just by inventing some story such that theism can be consistent with the evil.
Nope. That's that's not what we're doing. Again, there's this process called theoretical learning. Okay. And what you do is with that theoretical learning, you can actually rule out certain theistic hypotheses from that, right? And what you're going to be left with is basically, so once you contextualize the evidence and once you've updated your priors, then you can make that sort of argument that, hey, theism entails this story or that story, right? And I would argue, of course, that theism entails the Christian story of the world, but yeah, no, this whole idea like, oh, we're just inventing stories or blah blah blah. No, that's not how it works. What it is you're learning from experience, or it's again the formal term is theoretical learning, but yeah, that involves like changing sort of the theoretical content of your hypothesis to sort of, I mean, scientists do this all the time. So unless he wants to argue that like science is ad hoc because it's always changing itself, like it just doesn't really make any sort of sense. But anyways, I'm going to continue on now.
What we see in the world, right? Like you could still incur significant theoretical disadvantages, and you could still, it could still be shown that theism is just going to be a straightforwardly just a worse explanation for these facts, just a bad explanation. So I think that what he said there is just incorrect.
It doesn't matter like what version of probability you come up with, right? So that was sort of earlier in my journey before I came to my conclusion. That was one of my first sort of principles. Was like, okay, yes, there are different versions of probability, but fundamentally they're all sort of linked back to this ultimate question, which is why is God allow bad states of affairs to occur, right? Because I mean, it doesn't matter which version you come up with, right? Even all the versions that exist today, and even any versions that have that people that philosophy sites, or there's another example which is
some sort of axiological theory. When it's not clear to me that that's the case at all, it seems to me that
right. So that's just the first. That's really the general consideration I want to people to keep in mind here. That when it comes to any version of probability, let's really come down to that question, right? So now let's get into my four sort of points on the probability. So the first one is what I call problem shared axiology, right? So what does this mean? Well, I went over this in my debate, but I guess just briefly summarizing here. So in order for probability to get off the ground, it has to assume axiology, right? So it's going to have to like assume a more fundamental value theory, or what I call value assumptions, or a set of value assumptions.
All right, so I already disagree with what he's saying. He's saying basically that the atheist has to invent their own value theory in order to attack the problem of evil. It has to work from the assumption of some sort of axiological theory. When it's not clear to me that that's the case at all, it seems to me that even if we want to frame the problem of evil with axiology in the first place, which again is controversial. Like again, as I pointed out, Michael Tooley wants to frame the problem of evil with.
Yeah, and I've already addressed the fact that deontology is a subset of axiology. So even Michael Tooley's argument also makes axiological assumptions, even if it doesn't explicitly say that, right? So yeah, I've already addressed this before, so I'm not going to say much on it here.
Deontological terminology rather than axiological terminology. In fact, I'm actually kind of partial to that approach as well, because I think that framing the problem of evil with axiological terminology often leads to sort of consequentialist reasoning that I'm not a huge fan of as a deontologist. So basically, I basically like. First of all, like it's not clear that we would even be like framing this with axiological terms at all. And second of all, like it seems to me that we can just run the problem of evil as an internal critique. It doesn't seem to me that the atheist needs their own axiology.
Okay, so this is a fair criticism, but I will say, but I never said that the atheists themselves has to hold to the axiology. That's not what I said. What I said is that if they want to use a problem of evil, they have to start off with an axiology in order to generate the problem of evil. I didn't say that they themselves had to hold to that axiology. What I said, or what I mean by that is, like, I didn't say that, like, they themselves have to, like, actually propositionally hold to the axiology. What I'm saying is that in order for them to generate this problem of evil, they have to start off with axiology because that's how it gets off the ground, right? In order for a problem of evil to get off the ground, you have to assume an axiology, which means, again, you don't have, the atheist does not themselves have to believe in the axiology, but if they want to present an argument, right, an actual argument from evil, they have to use an axiology. Like, they have to, because any of the premises, any premise in an argument from evil is going to include axiological assumptions, right? And those include Michael Tooley's argument from deontology. Those include any consequentialist argument. Those, any argument where there's goodness or badness involved, right? Regardless of which theory of normative ethics you hold to, is going to include axiological assumptions. That's what axiology is, right? So this whole idea that, oh, well, you know, I don't need axiology. Well, if you throw out the axiology, you can't use an argument from evil, right? So it's not going to work, right? And so I think he's making, again, he's making, it seems like he's misunderstanding what I'm saying here. I'm not saying that the atheists themselves has to hold to the axiology, right? What I'm saying is that in order for them to generate a problem of evil, in order for them to present an argument to the theist, they have to assume an axiology. Not, again, they don't have to themselves believe in it, but the argument that they use depends on that axiology, right? That's all I'm saying. Okay, so anyways, let's continue on.
Let's get to his point.
Right. I mean, I think it's pretty obvious. I mean, if you're gonna say, okay, there's this bad state of affairs that God would not allow, well, you're gonna have to assume an axiology there. You're gonna have to assume that these actually are bad states of affairs in the first place, right? And so, in order for the problem to actually get off the ground, you're gonna have to assume a value theory. You have to assume that there is this sort of set of values that God is constrained by, and if God, if God violates those,
Well, you can say that there's a set of values that, in accordance with the Christian worldview, or accordance with with God's standards or what have you, are bad. And this is and basically in accordance with God's own objective standards, God is out of accord with them. He's violating his own objective standards. So basically, that's one way to frame the problem of evil. So I just don't accept that.
And I agree with that. It's internal critique, but that was not anyways.
The theist needs to assume their own axiological theory. It could just be an internal critique. And I also don't accept that we should even be framing this in terms of values or axiology in the first place. I think we should be framing this in terms of what actions are permissible or impermissible to do.
You know, that's false theism, right? Because on theism, God can only do good things, right? That's the whole idea. God is all good; he can only do good things. Therefore, you know, given a certain value theory, God can only do what is according to the value theory, right?
Yeah.
The problem here is that there are a plurality of different value theories, right? There's virtue ethics, there's utilitarianism, there's virtue ethics, there's utilitarianism, there's consequentialism,
I'm
right?
trying to see if
This doesn't
he.
necessarily mean that the problem won't work.
Here we go.
It's not clear to me that that those are going to be theories of value. I guess virtue ethics kind of is a theory of value, but like it seems to me that most deontological theories and most utilitarian theories are theories of moral reasons and the properties of actions, right?
Yeah, and moral reasons are a part of axiology. See, this is the reason why I don't get too much into moral philosophy, is because I think it's just a subset of axiology anyways, right? So the moral domain, when we're talking about the moral domain, so that includes moral values and moral duties, right? That is going to be a subset of axiology. It's just very, very simple when you think about it. There's no way you can really get around that, in my opinion. And even if it is the case, okay, let's just think of a hypothetical scenario where this is the case. Okay, even if it is the case that the moral domain is somehow outside axiology, right? Then I could just present the same exact objection, but I could just frame it in terms of the problem of shared morality. Like, I could just present the same exact scenario to them, right? And I can still run this objection that I have here in Zach's video. So it's just, again, even if we're granting, for the sake of argument, that somehow, I don't even know if this is even possible, but somehow the moral domain is like outside the axiological domain, I can still run the same argument, so it doesn't even matter, right? But regardless,
they're not theories of value. per se, anyways.
where God is sort of motivated to sort of produce virtues, right? And if virtues require certain suffering, then it just logically follows that God's going to have to, according to the theory, going to have to allow for a certain amount of suffering to occur, right?
Yeah.
And I think another consideration here, I'll get more into this.
Yeah, I mean, like, according if you want to subscribe to, like, again, if you want to again, we're talking about like not really value theory. We're talking about like what actions would be permissible to do. So,
Yeah, and that's going to be a value theory, right? That's going to be a moral value theory. So, anyways,
what you want to say is that it'd be permissible for that and have sympathy for the characters in the story, whereas no actual stuff. I mean, it seems to me that there's like a million ways, like to achieve virtues without suffering. Just imagine sympathy, right? Standard example is people. There needs to be some suffering that you can respond to in order to have sympathy, right? But there's a point to be made here that that's not necessarily the case. I mean, just imagine garnering sympathy through fictional reading fictional works, right? Just imagine like reading a story and having fictional instances of suffering, like suffering that doesn't actually exemplify the world, but rather are instantiated in this world of fiction, right, created by some author. You can imagine a world where people read works of art like that and have sympathy for the characters in the story, whereas no actual suffering is exemplified in the world. So it seems to me that that's the best of both worlds.
that might work for that example, at least for sympathy, but I don't think it works when we're talking like self-sacrificial love, or when we're talking about courage, or when we're talking about there's a lot of examples I can bring up, but when we're talking about feeling like actually getting to know somebody, like, and understand their struggles and their pains and like going through them, what I would term defeating them, right? You're not going to be able to get that on a view where everything's just sort of learned, or all the virtues is just sort of acquired through like this fictional narrative, because there are many virtues that I would say that you cannot have without actual like objective suffering going on, right? So that's really all I have to say on that. I mean, it is a fair criticism, I think. Like, yeah, maybe in some circumstances you could have certain like moral virtues without suffering, right? But that's definitely not the case. Like, there's a large number of virtues that you could not have that with, and especially you definitely cannot have defeat with that, right? Which I would say is probably one of the best virtues, which is basically the idea that we talk about self-sacrificial love when we're talking about those sort of higher level virtues that a lot of the saints had. You're not going to really have that on a sort of non-suffering world, right? And again, if you go back, and I'll mention this later in the video, but like all that God needs to do in order to, or the only sort of like condition that God needs to follow when it comes to allowing suffering is the defeat condition, right? So that's all. Like, that's all you really need. That's all that God needs to follow in terms of like what are the evils that God is allowed to permit, right? And I think that alone sort of accounts for the evil that we see in the world. So, anyways, there's more I could say on this, but that's all I have to say on that critique.
And I don't even think like virtue ethics would say that. It doesn't seem like basically like virtue ethics would say that that they'd be like they a big part of virtue ethics is they'd say that there's like intentionality about like what's right to do, right? And it's not clear, like, whereas it might be like all things considered good for there to be virtues in the world on the virtue ethicist theory, it doesn't seem to me that means that God would be permitted to allow that, right? Because it's not exactly sympathetic of God to.
Why would it not be allowed for God to permit that? Again, if we're using the defeat condition as a condition that God has to follow, where's the defeat condition being violated here? Like, I mean, unless he's going by the necessity condition, which I'm assuming he is, because that's what most people do. But yeah. Anyways, I'm not going to say much on this part because there's more that could be said later.
Sit back and watch suffering, so some other people can be sympathetic and respond with sympathy, right? It's not exactly courageous of God to allow soldiers to suffer horrifically in battle, lose families, so they can build courage. It's not God that's being courageous there. It doesn't seem to me to follow, right? Intuitively, if someone had the ability to prevent all these evils, all the suffering, without any risk to themselves.
Yep, this is where the necessity condition comes in. So basically, the idea is like, well, God just has to prevent all the suffering, right? That's going by the necessity condition, which I don't accept. We're going by the defeat condition here. So again, this comes. So he has. I mean, notice here he hasn't actually addressed my argument. Now, to be fair to him, at least in this part of the video, I didn't bring up the defeat condition until later. But I think we can already tell here that he's not actually addressing what I've said thus far in terms of this. Because if he actually understood what I was saying, he would realize, like, hey, maybe this is a pretty good argument. But anyways, people have their own opinions on that, but whatever.
We would think that that's a good thing, that's a good action, that should be done, and we would think that it's in the world. But on the virtue ethicist deontological theory, the theory of rightness and wrongness, I know it sounds like a contradiction, the virtue ethicist deontological theory, but and even if we are to assume utilitarianism, I mean, we can still take. There's like several approaches we can take. It doesn't seem likely that pain and pleasure being linked with reproductive success. It'd be surprising if pain and pleasure being linked with reproductive.
All right, so he's bringing up the pain and pleasure argument here. Now, there's a lot I could say on this. But the thing with the pain and pleasure argument is that it has to sort of assume, like, it has to have like what's called this evolutionary background, so to speak, right? And one of the things about that, hold on, let me see if I can find my notes on this, because there's a lot I could say on the pain and pleasure argument. Let's see here. So the problem is, first of all, psychophysical suffering, right? So when we're talking about pain and pleasure, which is psychophysical suffering, logically entails the existence of embodied consciousness, okay? Which means that you're going to have to assume the evidence for theism in the background already from the start, right? And the issue again comes down to this idea of Bayesian learning theory, where you have to go back and you have to think like, okay, you know what? I'm just gonna, Trent's gonna hate me for this, but I'm gonna play this and see what people say.
Look, he's got this situation where he talks about learning over time, where the theist makes a prediction and the atheist makes a prediction, and it has to do with priors about the distribution of pleasure and pain and their correlation with moral properties. And this is probably the best thing he has to say on this is the recognition that really it's I forget what he calls it, like moral theism or something like that, moral supernaturalism. That's really what distinguishes theism from from naturalism. That naturalism is morally indifferent. And so the whole program is that you expect these correlations between pleasure and pain with virtue and vice and so forth at these various levels. And he talks about first at the cosmic level, I think, and then at the plant level and the animal level, et cetera, et cetera. What he completely neglects is the whole idea of sort of version of what's called logical learning or revision of priors, which is a whole literature on this. Basically, Paul is committed to an axiom that Richard Jeffrey, I think, calls regularity, that your priors are set and can never change. And basically, no real Bayesian thinks this. So what he ignores is that the theist can say, on that first, bless you, I don't know if you hear my wife sneeze in the background. What he ignores is the fact that even if on the first round of predictions, the theist is like, well, that's surprising. What the theist can then do is go, now why might, given that that's not what I would have predicted, how might I have had incorrect expectations here? What would lead a God, were there a God, to do such a thing? And that might give you the insight that leads to soul-making theodicies, or ultimately to what I call the saint-making theodicy, where God has higher values that are instrumental than just a world of perfect paradise especially for the virtuous. The virtuous are not meant to just have virtue bestowed upon them. It has to be earned. It has to be hard won. And so you can come to realize those things through watching what God actually does allow in the world. That is a type of learning from experience that Paul just seems to utterly, completely ignore. And yet it's part and parcel of the human experience.
All right, so I don't know if Trent's gonna hate me for that, but so the point here is that it's this idea of theoretical learning, and this idea that why is it that as a theist, why is it that why did my theory make these false predictions or something like that? Well, what we can do is we can update our priors and we can understand like, hey, maybe here's the reason why God would allow it, right? And then we can update that in the priors. Right. And it's not ad hoc because we're not changing the content of theism, or at least we're not we're not adding in this story into the priors. Right. What we're doing is we're learning from experience. We're updating our priors based on new information. That's all that it is. Right. And the problem is, at least the pain and pleasure argument that Draper brings up there, or that he references, right? Because it is from Paul Draper ultimately at the end of the day. The problem with that sort of argument is that it sort of assumes that God would create a world in which every single time that someone goes through pain and pleasure, that you would have sort of these moral virtues or these moral values like just inserted into them, right? Without any sort of hard work involved. And that's just completely wrong. Like there's no reason to assume that God would create that sort of world. So even taking the best argument in regards to the argument from you, which is I would say the pain and pleasure argument, I don't think it works at all. Given that sort of reasoning that I just mentioned. I know I spent a lot of time with this, but anyways, let's continue.
Success is actually like the best means God has to achieve the most amount of pleasure in the world. That would be, I mean, it's not surprising on naturalism that we have this, but it'd be surprising on utilitarianism plus theism plus our background information that God would allow pain and pleasure to basically function as roles for utilitarianism. So there's like a million approaches, even with utilitarianism, that we can approach. So actually, on all three value theories, there's an approach we can take here, right? So it's not clear to me that there is a note for the theist in this regard, even if we assume that we have to assume our own like value theory and we aren't just doing an internal critique, or even if we assume, I'd say that we should frame it in terms of deontology, right? So let's continue.
So when I get into the next point, which is the definition, but the whole idea is you want to sort of lays out the game, right? Because it's like, okay, well, if you're going to come up with an argument from evil, you're going to say, well, God would create a world that's perfect, right? This is the imperfection argument, since we live in an imperfect world, and therefore God would not do that, right? And the issue that I see there is that you're going to have to make a lot of assumptions about what is perfect and what's not perfect, right? And you also have to make a lot of assumptions about what type of world are we actually judging here when it comes to what's perfect and what's not perfect, right?
Okay, I'll let him continue, but like, let's see where
in this case, the problem with what I call incommensurability, right? And the basic idea is that there are certain values in our world that you can't really compare to, like, I don't know, the value of like angelic world or something, right? So you're gonna have this incommensurability going on. So it's not like there's this universal set of like, okay, these are like the best values that could occur in any possible state of affairs, and then you have these lower levels. Like, no, I think there are sort of like they're incommensurable. Like you can't really measure them, so to speak.
Yeah.
Right? And I think so. Given that sort of problem, then I think this is relevant to the straight axiology, because the axiology is also going to sort of have this incommensurability issue, right? And there's a paper by I forgot his name, it's Rudio or something, but it talks about how any world that God creates, there could always be a better world, right? And a better world, and it's like, okay, well, you're going to this paradox where God just can't create any world, because any world that God creates, God just creates a better one, right? So in that case, given this sort of axiology there, then there's going to be a circumstance by which, because God cannot create the perfect world, because that's just metaphysically impossible, then there's going to be sort of the next best state of action that God can do is going to be an imperfect world, right?
Yeah.
Now, me and Tim, I know in our last rebuttal to Ben Watkins, we sort of pointed this out. And the basic idea here is that there's going to be, because of the incommensurability problem, given this sort of hierarchy of God could just always create the next best world, then you run into this issue where either.
By the way, go watch that video where me and Tim critique Ben Watkins on that. But anyways,
God creates no world, or God creates an imperfect world. And what I mean by imperfect world is that, just to be clear here, that imperfect world, what I mean is that it's incommensurable. So while it is true that God can only create the best world, that best world is going to be incommensurable to some other best world, right? In terms of value, right? Because you can't really measure them, right? And so because of that leads a lot of problems, because I see what a lot of arguments from evil they sort of do is they sort of assume one set of incommensurable values, but then they have to ignore this other set of incommensurable values that God may be more obligated or more motivated to act by, right? So I hope that helps in terms of.
Okay, so yeah, I'm not convinced by this response, this best of all possible worlds response. And there's a bunch of reasons why. For one, if God would create the best possible world, and if we assume that there's this infinite hierarchy of best possible worlds, so there isn't any the best possible world, then and the theist wants to use this to their advantage. They want to say, well, I mean, that just means that God wouldn't create the best possible world, so God can't be judged for creating less than the best possible world. Well, we'd be moving too fast here because, like, even though God didn't create the best possible world, there's a world better than this world that God could have created, like the next better world. And then there's the question of why didn't God create that world? We're not asking why God didn't create the best possible world, and we're going to grant that that's possible. It's impossible that God could create the best possible world.
Okay, so he's misunderstanding. At least he's misunderstanding what I was really saying there. So what I said was, again, that any world that God creates, there can always be a better one, but that's only if we assume what's called a value. Well, maybe I should have mentioned this originally, but basically, that assumes that God sort of is constrained by these value parts paradigms. We just add value to the world, and that makes it automatically better, or whatever. Like there's one less hurricane, or there's one less person that dies, or like that's what I mean by value parts. So basically, the idea is like for any world God creates, there can always be a better one, and that what that means is like, well, I could just take away if we just subtract, like, oh well, we subtract this evil over here, therefore that world over there, this world is better than that world because this world has one less like bug that died or something. That's what I mean when I talk about God cannot create the best possible world, right? But when I say that God did create the best possible world, I'm talking about it as a kind of world, not one specific world, right? I'm not talking about like our specific world, but rather I'm talking about as a type of world, right? And once we understand a type of world, then I don't think it's going to really be a problem. And in that case, then the atheist is going to have to argue like, oh, we don't live in the best type of world or the best kind of world. And I just really don't see where exactly that sort of inference can be drawn, right? Because any sort of argument you use to make that sort of argument is going to have to go through a lot of logical, axiological steps, right? That I don't think the theist is. I think there's going to be some point in which the theist just disagrees with them on that. So, anyways, I'm going to continue on because I still got an hour left, and I am at the 47-minute mark, which is interesting. Anyways, I'm going to continue on with the video because I don't want to go. I'm going to try not to go 3 hours, but we'll see how that goes.
Well, then it just follows that for any world God could create, there's a better world that some other being could have created, such that they would be morally better. And so all that would follow is that no being can have actions such that they're going to be morally perfect. And there's a couple of papers on this, one by Klaas Cray, there's one by William Rowe. I know the Howard Schneider's. I can't remember which Howard Schneider it was, but he has like an approach.
But the problem is that theism is not committed to the proposition that God has to create a best world. It's only committed to the proposition that God has to create a best kind of world. Okay, that's all that theism is committed to: a best kind of world, not a best world. Right. So when we change the conditions, when we say no, God is constrained to create a best kind of world, there's nothing contradictory about that. You can't generate a contradiction from that, right? So I don't really see where. Anyways.
This where he tries to argue against the best of all possible worlds argument. I don't think he succeeds, but I think I'm going to link those papers in the description. And another approach here is that even though God wouldn't create the best possible world, like we can even grant their assumption here, there's no best of all possible worlds, so God wouldn't create the best possible world. It's still not going to be obvious that God wouldn't create a perfect world, right? Because the perfect world doesn't mean a best of all possible worlds. It just means a world that has no flaws. You can imagine worlds that have higher.
So, okay, so this goes back to my Ben Watkins response on this, but when it comes to the imperfection argument, which is the one that Ben brought up, because I'm going to assume, I think Ben's argument is probably better than this one that he brings up, but I'm just going to bring up Ben's argument just for the sake of argument. So I think we understand when we're talking about a perfect world, right? I think the best way to understand this is like, it's perfect in a sort of relative sense, right? So one way to think about it is like there's this ideal instance of a given world, right? And so a perfect world would be a world in which lacks nothing and has no defects relative to the status as that world, right? And of course, Ben would say that a world is perfect if its wrong-making properties are sufficiently counterbalanced by its right-making properties, both known and unknown. Right. Now, again, I think this still does run into the problem of incommensurability and axiology, right? If we're going to talk about a best world, because we can just refer to a best kind of world. But this gets into the whole balancing off goods versus the defeat, right? And the problem is that defeat affirms that the negative or positive value of the part of a world may be said to be defeated within the whole world. So we're talking about the whole world, but we're talking about the entire timeline of that world, right? And of course, I would argue that the defeat condition is an aesthetic condition, right? And just to define the defeat condition here, Adams and Snyder would define defeat as an evil is defeated when it is integrated as a constituent part of a value possible whole that not only outweighs the evil, but cannot be as valuable without the evil. In that instance, the evil remains evil in its own right, but it is defeated, right? So one example is like, okay, pain is intrinsically bad, right? But pain can obviously be defeated. You can overcome pain, right? So yes, pain is intrinsically bad, but you can overcome pain, which is what the concept of defeat is. Right? Again, that's one example. There's plenty of others I can give. I just wanted to clarify that. But when we understand that the defeat condition applies to a value whole rather than a value parts, then you're not going to be able to make any sort of argument that like, oh yeah, you have this perfect world in terms of a value parts paradigm, right? And so I think the problem here is that, I mean, just to be fair, I don't know if I mentioned the value whole versus value parts paradigm here, but the point here is like it seems like he's assuming this value parts paradigm, which I would not accept in terms of that. So so yeah. Anyways, let's continue on.
In lower degrees of perfection, right? It seems to me that a perfect world is going to be a world that contains God alone, right? God being the greatest possible good, contains no evil, no flaws, has complete prior purity, right? And his existence alone doesn't entail any evil. So it seems like what we'd expect from God is that he wouldn't create anything, right? Because any creation that obtains, any evil that obtains, assuming that the evils are entailed by some greater good, or the greater goods are entailed by the evils of question, is what I should say. Like the greater goods entail evil. So
that assumes that God's value contains all values, which I reject. So I would say that God is a maximally valuable being, God is not what's called an omni-valuable being, which means God does not actually have himself. God does not have all the values that could possibly exist, right? Because there are certain values that actually do depend upon a sort of contingent world, right? And so if there are values that sort of depend, and again, I went over this in my video on the probable, but basically the idea is like, yes, God does not have all possible values, or at least not all, I would say all possible values, because you could have some values that are contradictory. So I'm going to say, for the sake of argument, just for clarity, when I'm talking about all values, I'm talking about all possible values, or values that are logically coherent with each other. Because obviously there might be some values that like cannot exist in the same world, but regardless, so yes, God is a maximally valuable being, but that does not mean that therefore he has all values, right? I think that you are going to get all values from a created world, right? So yeah, that's all I have to say. But I hope I made myself clear on that. But
even if we grant that, those greater goods are just going to be lesser goods. They're not anything compared to God, the greatest possible good. And some axiological theories, and some of the most popular axiological theories that theists use, those goods are only going to be good in virtue of resemblance to God anyway. So they're not good in themselves; they're good in virtue of resembling to God. Well, I guess you would still say that they're good in themselves, but they're good in themselves to the extent that they resemble God's nature, or that they resemble God's purpose, his telos, right? So, and if you take that approach, it's certainly not going to be obvious that the addition of any created worldly goods are going to be better, all things considered. than just a world where God exists alone. And it seems to me that then any evil that his creation produces is just going to be pointless, right? They're not necessary for any greater good that the evils would entail, even if we assume that all these evils entail greater good, which is already a generous assumption from the get-go, because it doesn't seem like we have any reason to believe that over the hypothesis.
To assume sort of incremental value set, right? So what I mean? What means that in order to say, we're not going to create this world or perfect world, whatever. Hey, that's according to what? Like, what's the value set you're using to judge this, right? Okay, the problem is, given certain value set, then there might be
But the problem is, given the theist's own commitments, God is the best possible good. He's the greatest possible being, qua good itself, right?
Yeah, but no theist is going to say, I mean, unless they're really confused theists, but I don't think any theist is going to say that God has all compossible values, right? Because logically, you can't have that, right? You logically can't have all compossible values, right? At least not in God. You can have it in a created world where God is in relation to that world, but you can't have all compossible values in God. I would say, right? So this is why I would argue personally that that theism entails actually that you would get a creation, right? That God, like, it's pretty much 100% guaranteed that God would create good things. God would create a world, right, with good things. That doesn't mean that it's metaphysically entailed from the hypothesis. Like, I'm not saying that it is metaphysically necessary that God does such a thing. I mean, some theists might go that route, but I would say that it's epistemically entailed that God would do such a thing, which is different than metaphysical entailment. So, anyways, that's all I have to say on that.
Classical theists will say that God is the good itself, and even if you're a theistic personalist, then you're just going to say that God exemplifies a set of properties that are just the maximal, goodness, while being maximal goodness. There's nothing in creation that could possibly surpass God's goodness. He is the greatest possible good that could exist, right? And so any evil that creation entails, or that is entailed by the evil in question, the greater goods that entail the question, I should say, those are just going to be lesser goods, right? They're not going to add goodness to the world where God exists alone. And so those evils are just unnecessary for obtaining greater goods, right? For any greater good that is entailed by an evil, there's a greater good that isn't entailed by the evil. God himself, right? God is the greatest possible good. He doesn't entail the evil. So it's unclear why God would make creation at all, right? It seems to me that in order for God to create creation, the world itself would have to transition from a state of absolute perfection where nothing but the greatest possible good exists. So just basically the best world, just a completely a perfect world that's missing no great making properties, no perfections, to a state where to a state that contains some imperfections, some evils, right? And at the very least, it seems prima facie that this poses a problem or a threat for theism.
I think this is a case where
It's not clear why God would do that at all. Why would you transition the world from a state of perfection to a state of less than to a state that contains evils, right?
not how the world is perfect, because there can always be a better world, you know, a better world. You know, that, right? So that's the incremental world. You have this incrementality problem, right? You can really, I think, at least.
So yeah, better world, a world better than that. So again, there's two responses. One, if there's no best of all possible worlds, then we're assuming that God would want to maximize like best possible worlds, which seems intuitive. Then so much the worse for theism, right? Because for any world God would create, well, we can imagine a greater conceivable being that would actualize a world that's greater than the world that He created. And so it's just going to be impossible for God to exist, right? At least God qua moral perfection. We cannot conceive of a being whose actions are greater, right? So it seems intuitive that creating the best possible world, but that's going to be something.
Yeah, sure. If you assume that God must have all compossible values, which is not entailed from theism, like, so I've already addressed this, anyways.
That, so it's some sort of measuring stick for the greatness of being at least part of it.
I will, because I didn't like it too well. It was not like I could agree with some motivations behind his arguments, but I was very like, you know, I was like, okay, this is not doing too well. But so what he was gonna say is that God is not in religion at all, right? So God, you know, God's all good, right? But then you know, God doesn't really have any obligations whatsoever, right? That's his position, right? And I can sort of understand the behind that, you know, but we need to come up with this sort of middle ground approach where, you know, instead of saying that God has no obligations, right? That's what extreme right? The other extreme would be that God is a human religion, right? God is sort of by these ethical human religion, right? And so the part, you know, a good around between those extremes, I think, one equal to, which is sort of that God is equal, which means that basically God has equal obligations only by him and nobody else. Now, why is this possible? Well, so two reasons. Number one is that a lot of arguments.
That's an interesting position. I've actually have heard of the position of God not being like a moral agent, not having moral obligations. I've actually heard that before. Of course, that's a horrifying thought, right? Imagine it doesn't seem plausible at all, right? Like if we assume that God's like a rational being, and what about him? What feature?
Okay, so this is the part where I start talking about God as a unique moral agent. So I've actually changed my position slightly on this. Let me just summarize where I've changed my position on this. So the first thing is that when I claimed that that God is in his own unique moral domain, right? I would step back a little bit on that. So I would say that the human domain and God's domain is actually the same, but that there are certain values that humans cannot achieve that only God can. So one example I would argue would be that defeat, right? So the concept of defeat that I mentioned earlier, right? Where basically God, and I would also say this can apply to humans as well, where basically you are only allowed to permit evils as long as they can be defeated, or at least they can guarantee sort of their defeat. Now, there are different versions of, there are actually different versions of the defeat conditions. So there's the view that like it's only possible for it to be defeated. There's the other that says it's necessary, that it must be defeated. I would say that I also take a middle approach that says that like God can only allow evils that are morally worth it to a creature, right? And that God must give them like infinite opportunities to defeat that evil, or at least a sufficient number of opportunities to defeat that evil. That's my approach. At least that's my sort of view on the defeat condition. So because of that, I would actually step back and say, like, yeah, God is constrained by the defeat condition, but so are we. However, humans cannot. It's much more difficult for us humans to achieve the defeat condition, right? We're not going to be able to, like, how if someone goes through pain and suffering, how are we as like limited creatures able to say like, oh yeah, like can you like how like if I sent like let's say I sent my kids off to like boot camp or something for like moral development or something, and then all of a sudden they like have this traumatic experience. As a human being, I'm not going to be able to like guarantee that they are going to defeat their suffering, right? I don't have that kind of power. Now, God, on the other hand, I would say does have that kind of power, right? So it's much more easier. And I would say, like, as God, because God is an omnipotent being, because he's all powerful, then he does have the ability to fulfill the defeat condition. Whereas we humans don't have that ability. So I would say that we humans and God are in the same moral domain, right? But that there are certain moral sort of conditions that only God can fulfill that humans just simply can't fulfill, right? That's what I would say, at least on this front. So for that reason, I'm not sure if there's much I should go over on this part because I have changed my position slightly on that. But anyways,
The only time I've seen
I don't think that's an assumption at all. Like, it could be granted that God shares some features to situations that human beings like can't share in virtue of their limited properties, right? That seems like wholly plausible to me, actually. But using his creatures as means to end. But then what the theist's reply to that would be is that God is a wholly other kind of moral agent, such that it would be totally rational for God to affirm his autonomy and not the autonomy of lower.
All right, so I don't hold his position anymore. So his critiques, I think, aren't really relevant. Just in the sense that I've changed my position slightly on this. I do think that God is still constrained by the defeat condition, but I would change and say that no, humans are also constrained by this condition. It's just generally humans cannot fulfill that condition, and so that's why we humans don't follow it. So anyways, that's all I have to say on that.
At all. Like, it could be granted that God shares some features to situations. Make babies now, right? No, that'd still be immoral, right? And this being is like fully knowledgeable, but he's like a Machiavellian sort of evil super genius, right? Of their limited properties, right? That seems like wholly plausible to me, actually. But like what the idea would be is humans being more powerful and more knowledgeable, it doesn't make it the case, like nothing about that lessens their obligations to not rape infants, for example, right? We wouldn't say that a human being, this human being's omnipotent, right? I guess it's permissible for him to, rape babies now, right? No, that'd still be immoral.
Yeah, see, this is where it really starts to get really like not understanding my position. So if you did have, let's say you did have an omnipotent human in this example, I don't think an omnipotent human. I actually think omnipotence entails all goodness, right? So I'm not even sure if you did have an omnipotent human, you're basically talking about God already from the start, right? And it's not like when I say that God permits evil, what I mean by that is that he allows it to occur. He's not himself causing. He's not like we're not taking a Calvinist view where God is like actually causing everything, like all the evil to occur, right? God permits it to occur, but he's not the one actually causing it. So I don't even think the example he's bringing up here actually works, because I don't think God would go and torture people. Like, that's why I don't even hold to an eternal conscious torment view of hell, is for that reason. So this whole idea that like, the omnipotent human that can just torture babies or something, like, I don't even think that applies to this. Like that's not even a coherent state of affairs. So yeah.
Right? This being is like fully knowledgeable, but he's like a Machiavellian sort of evil super genius, right? He wants to create a doomsday device to end civilization, right? No, you would say that being's moral, right? So when we reflect on our moral intuitions and when we start to like add God's properties to human beings, it doesn't seem to me that there's anything about God's properties, or if you don't want to assume that God's properties, there's nothing about God himself. That seems to me if we applied it to humans, would lessen our obligations, right? So that's going to be a sort of intuition pump there. So it doesn't seem to me that this idea of making God like, or claiming God is like this unique moral agent. Sure, there can be some unknown goods beyond our
So instead of again, this is a fair criticism. So I've already, by the way, I've already changed my position on this before I did my response to this video. So don't go back at me and say, oh well, Kyle's changing his position like right now. Like no, I've already changed my position on this. But basically, what I would say, instead of God as a unique moral agent, I would say that there are conditions that only God can fulfill that humans can't. That's what I would say. At least on this. So, anyways,
understanding, such that God has shares these this understanding of the situation or these features.
But I think the way, at least the approach that me and Tim will do, God's a unique I think that has a problem. Because we're not saying that God has no obligations. We're not saying that God has no constraints on him. Just as his constraints are unique to him, and they're not going to be purely, ethical human constraints, basically.
Yeah, I don't think once again, I don't think that we have to assume that it's the same constraints as humans. I just think that we can use intuition pumps to show that God's relation to the situation isn't so different, such that like he would be justified in allowing a lot of stuff that he obviously does allow if he exists, right? And of course, what we're going to need is some further arguments that, or at least intuition, right? Seems to me that when I reflect and look at like an infant learning stuff, it seems to me that there's something wrong with me about that, and there's nothing that I can see as far as I can see that's outweighingly right negative about that.
So one of the things I do want to bring this up. I don't know if this is really relevant exactly to what he's saying here, but I think another consideration in regards to arguments from evil is like when we actually look at them and we see what they sort of entail. So just think about this for a moment. Let's say you have someone that gets into a car accident and let's say they lose both their legs or something. Okay. Now there's two ways you can look at this. One way is to look at this is like this person's in a horrible situation and God wouldn't allow this sort of thing to occur, and so therefore God most likely probably doesn't exist, right? Whereas the other position could say like, this person has gone through suffering. How can he use that suffering for how can he use that suffering not only for a greater good, but that they can actually defeat their suffering or defeat the pain that they're going through, right? And when they're able to do that, right, then that's where the concept I would say of defeat comes in, right? Where they're able to actually overcome their suffering to an extent by which the suffering, yes, it still exists in like some limited sense, but it's overcome, it's defeated, right? And now you notice how in the second situation here, it is a different axiology in the sense that we're approaching suffering differently. So we're not making the conclusion that, well, God would never allow this. Like we're not assuming a sort of necessity condition here. We're not saying that God has to prevent this. Rather, we're saying that God allows this for a greater good or for a defeat of this evil, right? Now, of course, I would argue that you are going to need some sort of theodicy, right? So I'm not saying that like the defeat condition alone satisfies this, but rather the defeat condition is a prerequisite for a theodicy. It's the condition of a theodicy, right? And so once we have that condition in there, then I think you can generate a theodicy from that, which is what I've done before on my channel. But anyways.
And of course, this is where a lot of the evidential problems of evil come in. And when we look at like animal pain, other facts, other features of evil, like the moral randomness of evil, the frequency and distribution of evil, extremely improbable to me. Like even more probable than, at least like comparably improbable as all the fine-tuning constants. Like that's how insane to me it seems. Of course, it's logically possible. I'm willing to grant that's logically possible, but it just seems to me insanely improbable. Like when we look at all the features of evil, when we look at every instance of evil, like when we just.
So he's using he's actually using the inscrutable version of the argument from evil. So it's the many inscrutable evils. I think this is probably the best version of the problem of evil out there. But if a theist has a theodicy, or even if the theist has like different conditions upon what is considered a gratuitous evil or an unjustified evil, if the theist has like a different sort of definition than the atheist, then it's not going to work as an argument. It's not going to work. It's not going to work as like you can't even get the argument off the ground if you're using axiological assumptions that the theist is not going to accept, right? At least on that part. But anyways, let's how much time do we have? Oh, we still got about an hour left of the video, and I've been going at it for an hour. Oh man, this is gonna be a long one. I'll continue on, and then hopefully I'm hoping to get this done within 2 hours, but we'll see how that goes.
Look up so long and see all this stuff, and all these considerations, such as Michael Tooley's approach, Paul Weber's approach. It just seems extraordinarily implausible that they're all justified. that God's obligations will just happen to align with Damien, like
Yes, I totally agree. No way, the other extreme points. The other extreme well, we totally know God wouldn't. Just kind of around
Yeah, because on my video on one of the things I go over is this distinction. These two extremes, like self-theist, which says God, we can't make it about God, loves people. You also have this dogmatic, what I call dogmatic theism, which is where we know about God loves people, right? And what I found is that the best approach, right, is to be somewhere in the middle, right? So the atheist extremes. What is that? Well, it just means that we can't decide about God loves people, right? We have some sort of like, aesthetic, moral, what I call normative constraints that sort of guide God action, right? So we can, theism in that sense, adds like powers, you can sort of explain why we live in that world, right? By God, allows us evils, but it's not saying anything about everything, right? So in that case, then I think the cool thing about this approach is that it allows you to be research project, which means we're able to learn more about why God loves people. So like I admit right now, like I don't know every single reason why God loves people, right? That's a research project, right? We continually learn more about why God, does certain things, and so yeah, I think what that allows us to do is sort of, it shows us that theism can sort of be its own research project, right? We sort of understand, we can grow our knowledge and why God does certain things, and grow our knowledge and just can grow our knowledge and power theism, right? So that's how I do it, and so now of course I do want to sort of get into a little bit here what I think God's constraints are, right? So one of the constraints is going to be sort of aesthetic constraints, and what the core principle behind is what is called the defeat condition. When we intend to research this, we first came across the defeat condition in Adam's book, Principle of Plenitude. We also
The defeat condition. Yay, we made it, guys. I know I've mentioned it many times here, but I want to see what his response to this is. So I'm curious what he has to say on this part.
saw that and also found out his work on animal suffering. But the whole principle behind this research behind it.
I haven't looked up I haven't really looked into his book yet. I actually have his book in one of my PDS folders. It's in one of my folders. I haven't been looking at it yet though. Yeah, that's definitely something I want to check out.
So the whole idea behind principle is that God offers a lot of evil. Once evil is defeated, then evil is wherever evil has a creature, right? And I think I'm going to find it real quick. So this whole here it is. So Adams and John Snyder define evil as this, or defeat evil as this. And evil is defeated when it is integrated as a constructive part of the Bible possible whole that not only outweighs evil, but cannot be as valuable as it is without that evil, right? So in that instance, the evil sort of remains in the subject, right? But it's defeated, right? And it becomes sort of a greater possible whole, right? I think this condition actually, it's sort of thing what it does. It sort of shows that artists make fun of error. We're gonna a lot of them. I don't know if that's all the argument will do this, but what I've seen is that that's where even Roberts passes paper on his critical as well, where it's like, well, God is constrained by the necessity condition, and on the necessity condition, God can only allow evils that are necessary for good, right? So that's the necessary condition. Okay, you don't bring about goods if that evil, without good, not possible without evil, right? The problem is this assumes this does not assume human moral condition of evil, right? It sort of has to ignore this defeat condition idea, right? And so what I think the defeat condition does is it sort of nullifies the argument, right? So what it does is basically on that sort of view, even especially when we're talking about like.
I don't think I quite understand the defeat condition. I think I'll have to go back a little bit because I don't think I quite understand that. But I don't know if even I agree with what he calls the necessitation condition, because it seems to again have like these assumptions with like using like terms of axiology. That the only way to like justify gratuitous evil is if there's some greater good that entails it. So I guess I don't know if I would even assume the necessitation condition. I mean, I guess a lot of the best problems of evil, well, certainly William Rose assumes something like that. But hold on, I'll go back. I kind of want to hear what he said again.
Good, right? So that's the God offers a lot of evil. Once evil is defeated, then evil is wherever evil has a creature, right? Defeated evil is this, and evil is defeated when it is integrated as a constructive part of a valuable, possible whole that not only outweighs the evil but could not be as valuable as it is without that evil, right?
So that's the defeat condition. Valuable, possible whole. I guess I kind of understand that, but it's unclear exactly at what point that diverges from the necessitation condition. More valuable as a whole. It just seems to me. Seems to me to be something similar, at least, to saying that the greater good is entailed. I don't know. I'd have to think about that for a bit.
So in that instance, the evils are necessary for good, right? So that's the necessary condition. Okay, you want to goods if
it has to, and the necessitation condition is important because it has to be entailing. Otherwise, because if I like go and steal something, but then I realize that it was wrong, and then I compensate them like with $5 or whatever how much I stole from them, then obviously, right, like that doesn't make when I first stole the item. That doesn't justify, like, it was still a wrong action.
Okay, so this is where he doesn't actually do this here, but he does give a similar sort of argument, and that's the billionaire analogy. So, and I'll mention. I don't know if he's going to mention it because I'll mention it here just to clarify what the view is. So basically, imagine a billionaire going up to let's say a middle class income house, and he burns the house down. And then in compensation, the billionaire gives the person like $1 billion or some crazy amount of money. Okay. Now the question is that a morally right action just because they compensated for, just because the billionaire compensated for doing the damage to the property? I would say no. That is not a morally sufficient reason. You can't just compensate somebody's suffering. You have to defeat it. You have to defeat that suffering. So what that basically means is that they are able to overcome and to make that suffering a part of their identity, basically, if that makes sense. And it helps them to grow better as a person, right? When we have that, then, and this is where it becomes, this is where I think theism becomes, or at least why God is the only one that can fulfill this. But basically, even if you have like a rich billionaire, I don't think a rich billionaire is actually going to be able to like guarantee a defeat of evil for somebody. Like, it just does not seem at all plausible. I think only God, who is omnipotent, who has unlimited resources, is going to be able to do such a thing, right? So again, this goes back to the idea that, yeah, God has to compensate for the suffering, but he also has to help the creature to defeat that suffering, such that the creature can understand that the suffering is now a part of their identity, and made them who they are, right? I think once we understand that point, then I would say that it's morally justified, or at least that sort of evil is morally justified to allow, right? And the reason why it is different from the necessity condition is because the necessity condition sort of has this balancing off view and not a defeat view of how we sort of weigh these sort of axiological things. So that's all I have to say on that. But yeah.
Things considered, right? So it has to be an entailing relation, right? It has to entail the greater good otherwise. So yeah, it's going to be basically, I think what he's saying is that the evil is justified, not in virtue of there being some better world in which the evil doesn't exist, but like there being no better world in which the evil doesn't exist, right? But in virtue of the evil being just constituting some whole, some greater like compossible whole, which includes the evil as one of its constituents. I think that's what he's getting at, right? So yeah, basically what I'd say is that like this doesn't really nullify the problem of evil at all. You can still run Michael Tooley's, you can still run Paul Draper's, right? Again, it would be amazing, if it turned out that God's obligations in this defeat condition, or like God's responsiveness to this, which was known as this defeat condition, or such that it just so happened to be the case that pain and pleasure happens to align with reproductive success, right? There's all these facts.
Yeah, I've already addressed the pain and pleasure argument earlier with that clip from Trent Dowdery, so just go back to that if you want to get a response to that argument.
Flourishing, languishing among biological organisms, right? It'd be amazing if it turns out that God's desires happen to align, or God's reasons at least happen to align with all that. It just seems to be like just a post hoc sort of bad explanation for these features, right? And then there's features related to like moral randomness, like a child getting cancer.
Okay, it's not post hoc. Again, it's called learning, theoretical learning. It's not like we're adding in a bunch of stuff, right? So anyways, let's continue on.
On naturalism, it just seems like we have an explanation in terms of like the cancer metastasized to the brain, and that's it. At least in some cases. So the moral randomness of evil, and the fact they happen to people who are morally innocent, seems to be something that's that counts against theism as well. And then there's like a lot of other features of evil when we subdivide them into.
Okay, so here he's bringing up a lot of different versions of evil. I think this covers all of them. So the Theodicy that I have, I think covers pretty much all the examples he's bringing up here. Now, granted, my views have slightly changed, as I mentioned earlier. My views have slightly changed in regards to like, God's moral obligations and what that exactly entails. But anyways, I'm gonna try to skip now to. I don't know if there's anything else important he has to say here.
Yeah, in general, I'm not convinced that this response really does anything to the problem of evil, or maybe I have a stick up my butt. But I'm just not to make it the case that the theistic hypothesis is consistent, at least logically consistent with the evils we see in the world. Although I'm not even sure if I'd even grant that, because we see the datum, which is all this evil and all the features of these evils we see. It just seems like naturalism does a lot better than theism, or at least the hypothesis of indifference does a lot better than theism.
I think logical argument, but also I think the evidential argument, because a lot of evidential arguments sort of ignore this fact and sort of assume the what's called necessity condition, right?
Theism would be if you just the idea that God's desires line up with all this. But B, there's also a theoretical cost here. It just makes theism just a horrible explanation, right? Because I mean, anyone can stipulate anyone can tell a story that's consistent with their hypothesis that explains facts that seem prima facie inconsistent with their hypothesis, unless you have independent motivation for it, right? It doesn't seem like there's any independent motivation to think that this defeat condition would make it the case that God's desires align with all these features we see, right? So it just seems to make theism an untestable explanation.
No, because the defeat condition is going to be the axiology. So you have to assume an axiology in order for an argument for you to go through. You can reject the axiology, but if you reject the axiology, then you can't use an argument from evil. So the axiology is part of the background knowledge. It's a part of the tools we're working with to evaluate like what are good and bad states of affairs. If you get rid of the axiology, then that's it. It's not post hoc. Okay, these are preconditions for making judgments about what is good and bad, basically. And so there's no way it can be post hoc, because if it was, then you would have to basically get rid of the entire like project. And so anyways, I've already made my point on that.
Planetary impotent hypothesis, which it already has a lot of theoretical disadvantages, such as like ontological parsimony, right? It loses on that compared to naturalism. I think Graham Oppie in a lot of his work shows that.
Okay, yeah. So if you use an Oppian, I've already mentioned this in my I'm kind of glad he mentioned Graham Oppie, because I do want to talk about simplicity. But so Oppie's view of simplicity, I won't mention it here, but there's a lot of problems with it. If you want to know some of the problems that I went over it in my response to myself back in a few months ago. I did a response to my opening statement on, so I did a debate with Emerson Green, a devil's advocate debate, and I did a stream responding to myself, so responding to my own opening statement. And I point out in that stream a lot of problems with Oppie's view of simplicity. I'm not going to get into it here, but I'm just going to reference that video in case anyone's interested in that. So that's all I have to say on simplicity.
Sufficiently. So on top of that, it just makes theism almost completely explanatorily impotent. It just completely, in my opinion at least, destroys theism as an explanatory hypothesis, such that arguments which try to show that features of consciousness and fine-tuning are evidence for theism. Well, I mean, since you've basically kicked this divine psychology can off of left field, you've basically destroyed your chance of those arguments. You've pretty much destroyed theism as an explanatory hypothesis because there's no state of affairs that's going to be inconsistent with some story you can tell about God.
Nope, that's not. It's not. It's this idea of learning from experience. Okay, so it's this idea of updating your priors. Now, if it is the case that, let's say, that there is no logically possible state of affairs in which, or at least no probabilistic state of affairs where you have to build stuff and you have to build a sort of story into your priors, and then you sort of, okay, then yeah, I would agree that that would, I wouldn't say disconfirm theism, but that would definitely decrease the probability of theism, right? Now, I do mention the main issue with naturalism later, so I don't want to spoil my response in regards to that here, but let's see what else he has to say in regards to this.
Approach we're looking at like what is unique? So we understand have all the reasons given evil now. But knowing that the nature of valuables can and would be received. That's how matter now. They even sense started like being and what you know as equal can also good reasons to so yeah, straight like that. And just say we're going to have theism as this explanatory hypothesis at all, right? We like theism is going to be completely impotent and just useless as an explanatory hypothesis. We don't know what beliefs and desires to posit of God, and plausibly, if God is morally perfect, there has to be like some way of predicting God's beliefs and desires, such that like there's some evils that would be evil states of affairs that would be inconsistent with some state of affairs that would be inconsistent with God's desires. So what state of affairs are they that the theistic hypothesis rules out?
So I've already mentioned this many times. If you can find an instance in which there is an undefeatable evil, an evil that cannot be defeated, right, then you falsify theism. That's all you need to do. That is all you need to do to falsify theism. Just point out one state of affair where an evil is undefeated, or cannot be, or I would say, the undefeatable evil. If you could do that, you falsify theism. So right there, we already have a constraint. We already have a constraint in the types of worlds that God would create. Okay, that's all that's required for the atheist to make their case, right? That's going to be my challenge, not just for the person I'm responding to here, but for any atheist. Show me an undefeatable evil. Show me an evil that cannot be defeated. If you can show me that evil, I will abandon my theism. Okay, I will. But if they can't show it, then it's not gonna falsify theism. So, anyways, let's continue.
Right? In not in a help way, right? But what's the I'd say the degree to which a hypothesis is testable is the degree to which it rules out some state of affairs that's inconsistent with the hypothesis. But if you're going to want to undermine any attempt to sort of reason about what God's motivations would be, then it just seems to really harm theism as an explanatory hypothesis.
That if God has the ability to do something does not mean he's not has override motivation, right? What matters for theism matters for God is not his ability, but rather his motivation to do something, right? So if God has override motivations to allow for evils, then he will do it, right? If God has override motivations to do that, he has sort of like these metanormative motivations, these asexual motivations to pursue that. Then that's all it really matters, right? Just because God has the ability to do something else does not mean he's going to, right? What matters is the motivations that God has for doing action, right? So I just want to answer that question, but yeah.
Yes, great. So that's really like here's problem fine-tuned virtue. So let's that.
Yeah, so this one was a little bit tricky.
So yeah, that's 2 for 2. Those there are two responses about God's being a shared axiology and God being a moral agent. And the upshot is I find neither of them convincing, but hopefully this third response will be at least a bit more convincing to me.
Because I had to read I've read on this I think 3 times at least that chapter. I think it was chapter exactly what it was to me. Let's see here. So chapter chapter 7. That's okay. Yeah. So chapter 7 was where it sort of presents this argument from he doesn't necessarily call it virtue, but it's sort of an argument, right? Where it's like in order to have certain virtues, you have to have a world where there's sort of no range of good and evil, like the defeat of like in order to have courage, you need to overcome fear. In order to feel compassion, you have to understand someone's pain. In order to an argument, right? Where it's like in order to have certain virtues, you have to have a world where there's sort of no right. So the reason for that because they logically necessary addition to display of some nice virtues, right? You look at some saints, you look at generally speaking, like in order to have certain virtues, you're gonna have to go through certain suffering, right? You're gonna have to go through these trials in life, right? Whether like the defeat of fear, right? In order to have courage, you need to overcome fear. In order to feel compassion, you have to understand someone's pain. In order to forgive somebody, someone has to do a bad action against you, right? So these sort of things, there's plenty of examples of virtues, right?
Well, that's already a controversial claim. Like fear. I mean, fear doesn't necessarily entail suffering. You can imagine fear of losing from a game of sports, right? You can imagine building courage through engaging in athleticism, engaging in football, soccer. But you could build courageous virtues out of because courage obviously entails fear, right? fear itself, you might want to say fear itself is a bit of an evil, but like it doesn't really seem to entail a substantial amount of suffering, right? Just imagine fear when playing, like when you're engaging in football, right? Or even like sympathy and kindness, okay, that's metaphysically necessary, and it being not metaphysically necessary. I don't see any argument either way, right? But the response of sympathy to prior to creation, he's priorly pure. Like there's no good missing from God presumably, and if there is good missing from God, well, you just be saying that God's not the greatest conceivable being. How dare you, right? That would be almost heretical on a lot of views, right? And things are only good to the extent they resemble God presumably, or if you want to take that approach, they're good to the extent that they resemble that the purpose that God created for them, or something just like, right? So there's no good missing from God, right? And so this idea that that there's these virtues that entail evil and that the world's better, all things considered, just in virtue of having all these virtues, right? Seems to me that given your own view, you actually have a defeater for that. And I'm sorry, I know I've been gassing a bit. I know I've been spurting out a bit.
No like constraints. There's no value sort of. I'm more to my next section, but there's no constraint on what actually allowed it to be, right? You can have a world where everything's going good, you have a world where everything's going bad, right? There's no constraint. The only time naturalism has an advantage is going to be when theism doesn't have an advantage. So basically, theism makes all spiritual, right? We can get into that next one. But this qualifying virtues, I think what it shows is that naturalism makes no prediction about the 5 main virtues, right? So I don't think naturalism predicts there are any virtues at all, right? And that's a huge problem because more than virtues, you have a range of evil suffering. But it doesn't seem to me like you actually, on these naturalism, you're not going to expect this sort of things to occur.
Yeah. Okay. I think one of the things I think about with your next class, it's helpful for me like evil. One of the ways to help we like theism, just for percent both theism and having like this way. Well, it's naturalism, right? It's the same problem. There's no versus world. Like I imagine ground look on the better. Really understand affairs. Studies the whole thing. Evil is really about well, naturalism leads to this, and you know, it's very likely that you like evil is evil.
Yeah. So yeah, this could be fixed if you insist on like starting with naturalism, rather than something like a hypothesis of indifference, because that'd be another approach. Like given naturalism alone, yeah, we don't accept this world. But like if you do something like which this is Paul Draper's approach, you include naturalism plus our background information, the relevant sort of background information, or theism versus our
All right, so this is where I'll say more on this. Hold on.
background information, the same set of background information. We add, so we basically take the priors of theism and naturalism, and then add our background information to both of them, and then we add the datum, which is going to be like these evils we see in the world and the features of these evils we see in the world. Well, naturalism better predicts them, I'd say. Because
Nope. That's I would that is what Trent says it's Bayesian malpractice. But so what he's saying is that we need to include our background knowledge of all these things, right? I'm going to slow this down. Let me see exactly what he said. Wow, this is the first time that I've had to go back. Anyways,
so forgive me here, but like I'm trying my best to articulate myself and the response.
Yeah. Right. Okay. That's super great. I think one of the things, and I think it's overlap a little bit with your next class. It's helpful for me, like thinking about the problem of evil. One of the ways to help me is thinking about like maybe like
starting with naturalism, rather than something like a hypothesis of indifference. Alone, yeah, we don't expect this world, but like if you do something like, which this is Paul Draper's approach, you include naturalism plus our background information, the relevant sort of background information, or theism versus our plus our background information, the same set of background information we add. So we basically take the priors of theism and naturalism, and then add our background information to both of them, and then we add the datum, which is going to be like these evils we see in the world and the features of these evils we see in the world. Well,
so there's a few problems. Well, there's a lot of problems with this. Unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to go through every single problem in this response just because I plan to have a video on this, not specifically this problem, but just my whole case for theism in general. And I do sort of respond to Draper's points on this, but so one of the main criticisms that I have of that sort of argument is like, well, first of all, a lot of the evils that like in order for the argument to sort of get off the ground, so to speak, in order to like have evil, you're going to have to assume the evidence for theism, or you're gonna have to assume phenomena that is already evidence for theism from the start, right? And the issue with that sort of response is like the moment that, well, let me see if I can find my notes on this. I do have notes on this. Let me see if I can. It's been a while since because I've been like literally, I have been swamped with college in terms of this. Let me see if I can find. Oh, here it is. Perfect. All right, I'm going to share my screen now to. Oh, yeah, I'm going to share my screen. Hold on, another different screen, just so people can understand where I'm coming from on this. Where is it? There we go. Perfect. Okay, so this is the article. Yep, this is it. So, does the evidential argument for naturalism succeed? I'm going to go down so we can understand the argument. And this is taken from Draper and Lauder. Draper sets out his argument for premise 1, evolution is much more probable if naturalism is true than if theism is true. Pain and pleasure related to pre-productive success are much more probable if naturalism is true than if theism is true. 1 and 2 together are very much probable if naturalism is true than if theism is true. Naturalism is least probable as theism. Naturalism is very more probable than theism, all evidence equal. Naturalism tells theism is false, highly probable theism. Therefore, highly probable that theism is false. So the problem is, of course, that if you use what's called a Bayesian network on this, the data that you're using actually depends upon background knowledge, and that background knowledge depends upon, well, actually, here's the issue, is that the evidence for naturalism, so the evidence from evil, depends upon the evidence for theism, basically, but not reverse. So the evidence, again, let me say it clearly, the evidence for naturalism depends upon the evidence for theism, but the evidence for theism does not depend on the evidence for naturalism, right? That's the simple way of understanding it, but let me see if I can find exactly where the Bayesian, okay, here it is, perfect. So you start off with pain and pleasure, evolution, and then, you have naturalism right here, which is around 80%. I don't know if you guys can see that, but yeah. So that's the premise, right? So notice this is the premise of the argument if we're going to use a Bayesian network. And then let me see if I can find, where is the other one? Let's see here. There's a lot of, okay, this is the chart I was talking about. Okay. So at first we have naturalism 80%, theism 20%. So naturalism is 4 times more likely to be true given this, right? But if we shift, so if we break apart the evidence, we say naturalism, theism. So naturalism has 0.67, theism. So notice it's a little bit different here. And then naturalism. So in most of these cases, naturalism is ahead at first, right? So that's the premise. But the problem, because this is where it becomes relevant. So the problem is that pain and pleasure require consciousness, intelligibility, moral beings, and of course, religion, mental health, physical health, etc. But the problem is that all these things are far more likely on theism than naturalism. So the probability of consciousness is twice as likely under theism than naturalism, right? Even Jeffrey Lauder has made this point, right? And I'm going to go a little bit slow on this because this is somewhat technical of a response. I don't want to get too deep into it because I'm going to be doing a whole video on this later on. But consciousness given naturalism is around 0.5, but consciousness given theism is 0.90, right? So intelligibility, you get the same sort of probability. I don't want to get too much into this, but so the assumption is that the probability of intelligent design is 1.5 times as likely under theism as naturalism. Now some people are probably skeptical. Okay, now he goes through all, there's existing moral beings, and then finally there's religion, mental health, physical health, etc. Now, when it comes to when we actually update it, so when we remove assumption 5, so assumption 5, let me see if I can figure out what assumption 5 is. What is assumption 5? Hold on. Trying to get lost here. Assumption 5 can be acceptable under some experimental. I'm not sure what he's referring to here. Let me see if I can find it. I can't figure out what assumption 5 we're using. Anyways, I'm going to do a whole video on this, but basically when we remove that sort of conundrum, then you actually get the case where theism is far more likely than naturalism, given the fact that naturalism depends upon the evidence for theism, right? So this is the updated probability. So we got religious mental health 100% on theism. We've got moral beings 100%, intelligibility 100%. So when we do the total calculation, it's somewhere like 78% more probable that theism is true than naturalism. Once we do that sort of updating, right? Now I'm trying to figure out where exactly assumption 5 is. Hold on, let me. Assumption 5. Assumption 5. Let's see here. I think, okay, figure 2 illustrates assumption 5. Okay, so this is what argument 5 assumes. All known confinders do not include the association between pleasure, pain, and reproductive success. All known confinders does not influence the association between evolution and worldview. Let me see. Oh, yeah. All other evidence held equal. Okay, so this is where it becomes a problem. All other evidence held equal. Well, what evidence are we talking about? What evidence are we talking about here? We're talking about the evidence that your evidence, we're talking about the evidence that your evidence depends upon. Okay. All other evidence held equal. Why should we assume that naturalism and theism have a 50% probability? Like, why should we assume that consciousness is is as equally as probable on naturalism, or even fine tuning, or anything else for that matter, right? Now there is another issue with evolution specifically, which, okay, I'll just mention it briefly. I'm going to stop sharing my screen because I think I've made my point clear enough on this. Let's see here. So think of it this way. Okay, let's think of a thought experiment for a moment, just so I can have people understand where I'm coming from on this. Let's say that we have somebody that, let's say one person say, I got a 10% raise. And another person says, well, actually, let's start off, I have a 5% raise. And the second person says, oh, I have a 10% raise. Now, initially, you may think the 10% raise is actually better, right, than the 5% raise. However, the problem is that this doesn't take into account the total money that they're actually making. So if person A, who has 10% raise, only makes 10 grand a year, then they're only going to be making $1,000 more a year. Whereas if person number 2 makes 100 grand a year and a 5% raise, and they're making $5,000 more dollars a year from the raise. So obviously, even though, yes, the 10% raise is going to be initially better, when we take into account what's called the total evidence, well, it just turns out that person 2 with the 5% raise is going to be better. Why did I bring this example up? Well, the same thing applies to theism, where when we're talking about especially like evolution, for example, like let's say there's a 50% probability that evolution is true on theism, and then you say, well, it's just 100% probable on naturalism that evolution. So like, life could not exist without evolution on naturalism, but life could exist without evolution on theism. Well, the problem is that evolution depends upon an orderly universe, and obviously I think an orderly universe is more likely on theism than naturalism, right? So the problem is that Draper is not counting. He's not looking at the total outcome space. He's only focusing on like one part of it and then trying to build in all this background knowledge. And obviously that doesn't work. It doesn't work. He's cheating, essentially. Now, granted, okay, I'm not gonna blame, I'm not gonna blame Truth Teller here for making that same error, right? Because he got it from Draper. But I just want people to realize, like, there are fundamental, like, methodological problems with these sort of arguments that I don't think work at all. I'm not going to get too much into it because I'm going to do a whole video on this later on, but that's all I have to say on this particular point. And I think that sufficiently addresses what he had to say here. So
Naturalism better predicts them, I'd say, because again, naturalism, given our background information about natural selection, since we know that these other features of natural selection.
Yeah, and that falls into the Bayesian network problem that I mentioned earlier, so I don't need to repeat that.
Like we know that our organisms evolved, and considerations so far have shown that.
Yeah, because one of the things that I sort of noticed is like even if this sort of world is unlikely on theism, well, how is it more likely on naturalism? Like
Exactly,
where is that going to play into there? And I think one of the issues I think a lot of people don't understand is even if it's like 1% probability that we're living in this happy universe on theism, as long as that's higher than on naturalism, like let's say if it's 0.5% on naturalism versus 1% on theism, well, theism's gonna have like double the advantage, right?
Even like honestly, probably a lot worse for naturalists. There's a lot more than like 200 different universes that could have existed. So I think it's a lot worse for them.
Yeah, so this whole idea of fine-tuned virtues, I think that fine-tuned virtues are sort of
without these virtues. So how are these virtues good making, right? So you have like this sort of like dilemma here. Either God possessed these virtues prior to creation, or he didn't.
Okay, this is the classic argument. Oh, well, God himself doesn't have these virtues, or at least didn't develop these virtues. So again, we're talking about incommensurable value. So God didn't develop these virtues, but that doesn't mean that God doesn't have motivations to create beings which develop these virtues over time through hard work and through hard suffering and stuff like that. So I again, this runs into the whole incommensurability problem I mentioned earlier, right? So I don't think this. I mean, this is like an old argument that like was addressed like thousands of years ago by Christian philosophers. I'm surprised that like atheists even still use this kind of argument. But anyways, let's continue.
If he didn't, then well, the greatest possible good existed without these virtues, right? The most maximally great being existed sans any of these virtues, which means that on your own view, it's hard to see how these virtues would be valuable at all in the first place, right?
They are valuable in the sense that you have beings which develop the virtues. Okay, that's an incommensurable good. That's an example of a value that God doesn't have. God does not develop virtues. Okay, he already has them as part of his nature. But obviously, developing moral virtues is a unique good that only applies to humans, right? So again, I mean, that's just one example. There's plenty of other examples I could bring, but that is one virtue, or at least one good that humans have that God doesn't necessarily have, right? And that's not a bad thing, because again, we're not saying that God has to have all possible values. So yeah, anyways.
Whereas if God did have these virtues sans creation, well, then these...
I'm not going to respond.
So this is actually, so this final problem I think is actually probably the most consequential for the problem people. I think that not only does this problem sort of nullify, so not only does it, I think, refute the problem totally, but I think it actually reverses it, right? I think it's very simple, to point out here. There's a few considerations. So I call this the problem of value mapping at Theodicy, right? So for theism, there's a good mapping from God's nature to a state of affairs, right? So you have God is all good, right? So then
first of all, like, if you want to say that it's not expected, then if you want to say that naturalism doesn't have any of these anything here, then I would say that doesn't really do anything to the idea where more moral values and moral reasons are going to be just identical to sort of natural property. But of course, I don't really find moral naturalism convincing myself, so we can just forego that. Hold on, let me actually go back and see what he said again.
Explanatory account of why there is good and evil in the first place, why there is a set of good and evil in the first place. But
so I would say, okay, so why is there good and evil in the first place? Well, the moral naturalist is going to want to say that the evil, good, they're going to give some naturalistic account, some causal naturalistic account of evil is such and such homeostatic cluster of natural properties, and we can trace back its naturalistic history to blah 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 blah. And they want to say that this is the kind of thing that's empirically verifiable and discussable, right? And we do know the source of pain and the source of blah 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 blah, like whatever naturalistic account you want to do, right? Or if you're like an Aristotelian neo-Aristotelian naturalist.
Okay, so we're talking about the hypothesis of indifference, moral. I think he called it moral naturalism. I'm not sure how that's relevant here. Yeah, so I don't really have much to say on this.
You have some other account.
Let's see here.
I don't know.
Like that. And I think that at least the theodicy that I'm still working on it, but at least I have most of it out, which is basically what I call the evolving world theodicy. I did a video on it a while back. And basically the idea is that God sort of is going to create an evolving world, right? And I don't know if you want me to get into that or not, if you want to get into my theodicy or not, but yeah, I do provide a sort of theodicy that sort of accounts, right, for the
distribution. And another thing to say about theodicies is that, there's actually a couple things to say about theodicies here. One is that pretty much all theodicies are going to lead to what's called extended theism. You basically take theism plus this hypothesis about God's desires, or this hypothesis about the evil in the world. And I'd say that if you're just going to add that to theism and give no independent justification for why it follows from theism or is entailed by the hypothesis of theism, which I don't think I've pretty much like almost never encountered a theodicy which gives convincing independent justification for such a thing. It seems like it's more of like a top-down reasoning approach. Like we see this evil in the world and we create this theodicy to explain it, right? Unless you give independent justification for it, then it just seems like you're just like reducing the prior probability of theism.
All right, so this gets into the priors. If you want to see my criticisms of Paul Draper's use of the priors, see my video with Tim Howard where I critique Ben Watkins because he uses the same sort of reasoning there. That's all I'm going to say. That's all I'm going to reference. I'm not going to talk about Paul Draper anymore unless he brings it up. But yeah, that's all I have to say on that. So
by adding this just sort of like tacking this theodicy on to the hypothesis, right? So that's one point to make, and another is that pretty much all these theodicies, I'd say like basically all of them, just really do violence to our moral intuitions, and Stephen Meissen even has a good paper on this. They pretty much undermine ordinary morality, right? Like take the free will defense. Intuitively, we don't think that like if I were to like sit by,
I mean, sure. Okay, so I could probably grant this point in terms of like I think most theodicies are bad, but that doesn't mean all of them. I mean, has it even looked into like Trent Dowdery's theodicy or like Marilyn McCord Adams' theodicy or even my theodicy or well, Suan Sona, he has his own theodicy, which I'm going to be talking to him hopefully soon about his theodicy because there's some universalism stuff there, but I'm not really like, okay, I can accept the fact that like, okay, yeah, most theodicies are bad. I'll grant that. But like, that doesn't mean that all of them are bad. Like, I think that's just a huge, huge leap. But anyways, let's continue.
And watch an infant be raped because, like, I didn't want to like interfere in the perpetrator's free will.
Yeah, that's the free will theodicy. I don't hold to a free will theodicy myself, so I don't have much to say on that. But anyways.
Theodicy for another day. So we can just make problems. Maybe we can do another conversation because there's a lot of fun. So we talk about these four things, and one thing I just want to like reaffirm for people listening and viewing is like this showing like this big problem with like naturalism and explaining evil. Like say that like you look at like a specific evil and you're like, well, there's like a 1 in a million chance that like theism could explain this evil. Well, you think about naturalism. Well, naturalism is actually better than 1 in a million. If I think about the way like possible worlds, it seems like there's a lot more than a million possible ways these things could have gone given naturalism. If that's the case, theism still is a better explanation of this, even if it's like a really poor one in your view. It's one of the big problems for naturalism that we can emphasize is that what really does naturalism better predict these? It's really hard to see.
I don't. There's dogs fighting in the background, so I apologize if you can hear some weird stuff. But anyways.
Yeah, just hard to see. Yeah, because I think that a lot of the times what when these debates sort of, especially with theodicy, right? So with the theodicy, you know, the explanation for why they're evil and naturalism is like, well, the universe is indifferent, right? But then it's like, okay, well, how would an indifferent universe get you like any sort of state of affairs where there's, you know, good or bad states of affairs, right? But what I meant to say is like, okay, one example is like, well, one explanation of evil and naturalism is like, well, you know, the universe is indifferent, okay, that's fine, right? That's an explanation. But the moment that, you know, theism sort of imposes the limitations of the evil, like so one example is the defeat condition, right? So if God can allow evils to be defeated, right, then that's going to automatically provide a better account than naturalism, right? Or God allows evil so that we can grow virtue. Okay, well that's going to also provide a better account than naturalism, right? It's not all clear to me why naturalism actually explains evil better than theism, at least given a theodicy like that. So again, I don't want to get too much into theodicy, but I just want to point out here that you do have this problem of value mapping. So you do have this issue of, you know, you get to it allows evil so that we can grow virtue. Okay, well that's going to also provide a better account than naturalism, right? It's not all clear to me why naturalism actually explains evil better than theism, at least given a theodicy like that. So again, I don't want to get too much into theodicy, but I just want to point out here that
well, I think for the reasons outlined, I think it's very easy to show that naturalism better explains theism, and that such a theodicy doesn't succeed at all.
You do have this problem of value mapping. So you do have this issue of, you know, you get to from God to a good state of affairs. Change my position, especially in like in relation to like how God actually, you know, does his actions, right? So I had to like
so basically I think that Christian Ideal, Kyle here, I think he's misunderstanding Dawes' point here. So what Dawes is saying is that in order for like he basically in the first part of the book he sort of shoots down a lot of criticisms of theism being not a good in principle explanation, and in principle means that there's no way that in principle theism could be a good explanation for the facts we see in the world, right? It's just not possible. Theistic.
Okay, here comes Gregory Dawes' stuff. This will be my last response, and then I'm going to close the stream. But yeah, let's see what he has to say on this.
Theistic explanations just have this sort of inherent defect, such that they couldn't even in principle be a good explanation. And Dawes spends the first few chapters shooting that down. And basically, Dawes comes to the conclusion eventually, in light of all the criticisms of the previous chapters by people like Sober. I can't remember exactly who it was, but like I know Elliot Sober is one of the names that were mentioned. Basically, the conclusion he comes to is that the only way for theism to be a good in principle explanation, and there is a way for theism to be a good in principle explanation for the features we see in the world, is if we use the rationality principle, which is the idea that we would expect agents, all things considered, to maximize their desires to act on reasons such that like they would like maximize their needs. So their desires. Like take for example, a person named Angie who's sitting in a chair and she walks up to the window.
I mean that's fine. I have my own principles regarding God's actions. I mean, I think the rationality principle is like a good principle in terms of that, but like I think we need to understand, well, first of all, God's going to act for axiological reasons, which includes the moral domain, the aesthetic domain, and then the alethic domain, right? So I think that God, given the type of being that God is, he's actually going to perform different kinds of actions than humans, in the sense that like he has more freedom, so to speak. But I would probably at least agree. My criticism of Gregory Dodge's there was primarily about his condition regarding evil. So his idea that like that God would not allow suffering, God would not allow like unnecessary suffering, or that God would prevent suffering. That was my main criticisms of Dawes. It had nothing to do with his principle of rationality. So that's all I have to say on that.
Window and closes the window. So basically, what we posit is, like, if we want a successful agential explanation, is we posit specific desires of Angie. Like, she sees the window, there's cold air coming in, she doesn't.
Okay, so this gets into the whole issue about like why would we expect God to produce one state of affairs rather than some other state of affairs? Well, I actually, at least personally, I don't know if not all theists hold to this, but the view that I hold to is what's called the Principle of Plenitude, which is basically the idea that God will create all possible good, or a variety of good things. So not only just moral good things, but also like aesthetic good things and alethic good things. And I forgot the exact definition or the exact like terminology of what the Planitude Principle was. I think, yeah, Josh Rasmussen has it in one of his papers. But basically, it's the idea that God will create a plenitude of good things. And we don't need to build in a specific intention for why God did like this action over some other action. All we need to do is just identify that there is a good reason or a good action for why God created it. So, and again, that's all that's needed for theism, because if we compare it with indifference, there is nothing about indifference that will make any meaningful predictions about like good or bad states of affairs. So that's where I think theism has the advantage, at least in terms of just the fact that good things exist. I think is like automatically like sort of favors theism in this sort of way. Although I would argue it's very weak evidence, if we're being that broad. But yeah, there's more I could say on this, but I don't want to spend how long are we? Okay, I'm gonna end the stream soon, so I'm gonna finish my response.
Want to be cold, so she closes the window so that the cold air doesn't make her cold anymore, right? So, and she's basically responding to the reasons she has, and given the desire, making a good explanation for facts we see in the world. And what the Gregory Dawes suggests is that we put on what's called an optimality condition, which is.
Hold on, I don't know if you guys can hear that. The dog is barking. Hold on. All right, guys, I'm gonna have to close the stream very, very soon because the dogs are causing a lot of problems. But anyways, let's finish this video.
Is that we would expect, given God's moral goodness, given his moral perfection, we would expect, all things considered, that God would try to maximize goodness and minimize suffering, right?
Maximize goodness and minimize suffering. There it is. That's the necessity condition. Okay, I've already mentioned the fact that there's no reason to think that God is only constrained by this. That's why I said specifically that God is constrained by the defeat condition. Okay, yeah, it's not the same optimal condition as what Gregory Dawes has, but that's exactly my criticism, is that Gregory Dawes is assuming a sort of necessity condition here. And as a theist, I don't accept that, right? I hold to the defeat condition, which still does, by the way, still have an optimability or whatever constraint on theism. It's just not the same one, right? So that's all I have to really say on that. But anyways,
And he's basically saying that, like, given that moral perfection is the only like information we have about God, this is the only prior access we have to understand God's desires. This is the only way that there can even be in principle explanation of given a theistic hypothesis, right? We have to impose these optionality constraints on God's desires, right? Otherwise, theism doesn't make any predictions at all. Like, we can imagine, we wouldn't have any clue what desires to posit of God, right? Like, God's existence, for all we know, would be consistent with like fucking a world made of cheese, right? Or a world with, I don't know, like some then. You wouldn't even have an in principle explanation. Like, God couldn't even be an in principle explanation.
All right, so I'm gonna stop my my video now because yeah, I'm just gonna stop it. So that was very, very interesting. I've gone on for almost 2 hours now. I'm actually I thought this would be a 3-hour stream, but I guess I did skip some of what he had to say there because it wasn't. I've either changed my position on the matter or I've either I changed my position and so it wasn't really worth it to do a response, or he just didn't really understand what I was saying in the beginning in terms of like, what I meant by axiology. So let's review very briefly. I'm going off the top of my head here, so I haven't written any of this down. But number one, he misunderstood my concerns regarding axiology. So deontology is a subset of axiology. Okay. So right there, he misunderstood what I was saying. Number two, in terms of the Paul Draper stuff. Okay, so I've already critiqued Paul Draper's use of simplicity, or not use of the priors and a stream with, I think it was with it was on the same channel, it was on Zach's channel, but I did it with Tim Howard in response to Ben Watkins. So you can watch that for my critique of that. He misunderstood my concerns regarding the response to Gregory Dawes, and like, okay, I my main criticism of Dawes was like how he was talking about the optimability condition, because that does assume a sort of necessity condition. I mean, it literally says it right there, right? Hold on. All right, and we are back. I'm gonna just end this stream like in a few minutes. So what was I? Oh yeah, he misunderstood my use of axiology. He misunderstood my critique of Gregory Dawes near the end there. He didn't really seem to understand. Like my points about the incommensurability stuff. So he didn't really understand, like, when I was talking about incommensurability, I was referring to a kind of world, right? And then, of course, just to be fair, I will be fair to him on this, but the other aspect, I think, was in regards to, he seemed to assume like a value parts paradigm rather than a value whole paradigm, which is relevant, I think, definitely relevant for the problem view, because when we're looking at this, I think most people are looking at it through a value parts paradigm and not a value whole paradigm, right? And so when we do that, then it's much more easier for one to run arguments from evil given that. But I think if we look at this through a value whole paradigm, then you don't have that sort of issue, right? Then you use the defeat condition, and then you can better account for the evidence. And then I think you got that. And then, I've changed my position on God being a unique moral agent. So I would say that there are moral obligations that only God can fulfill. Not that God is necessarily like in his own moral domain, but rather that there are moral obligations or moral duties, so to speak, that only God can fulfill. And like those moral duties are so unique to him, and that, that's why we humans typically don't try to pursue them, right? Or at least pursue like those sort of conditions, right? And then I forgot what else. Those are like the main points there. I think a lot of his criticisms against the virtue stuff was not really sufficient, especially given like the defeat condition and given the fact that like there are higher order like virtues that like you logically cannot have without some intense suffering. One example is like self-sacrificial love. You cannot really have that, you know, when you talk about like, for example, Jesus or many of the saints, you can't have that. And so regardless, I just don't think it was a good response. I think there's a lot of problems. Now, granted, I actually am glad that he brought up Paul Draper. I'm glad that he brought up a few of those atheist scholars or whatever. I forgot the exact name that he referenced them. But so yeah, I'm happy about that. I'm happy. Like, people want to respond to me, go ahead. I don't care. Like, just know if you do a response, I might do a response back. I mean, not all the time, but I probably will. So this is my first response to a criticism. Now, in terms of my next response, because I will be doing a few of these, my next response is probably going to be on Apologia's video in regards to the whole Craig thing. I'm mostly there. I'm probably just going to clarify my positions on what I thought about the situation and stuff. There are a few arguments that he made there, which I want to address, but yeah, so this is my first response video. And I thought it was good. So thank you guys for listening and watching. If you have any questions in the comments, let me know. I'm sorry, I wasn't like completely organized in this response. I'm just sort of going off the top of my head on these sort of things. So I apologize if like I'm not super organized and stuff. But yeah, that's all I have to say. So anyways, have a nice day.